知らない言葉を覚えてゆくたび
Ever since I watched A Silent Voice, I've become quite interested in Kyoto Animation's works. I finished Sound Euphonium afterward, I went on to watch the majority of Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, and sometime soon I'm planning to watch Liz and the Bluebird, and maybe I'll get around to watching some Kyoani. And among these works is Violet Evergarden, a 13-episode anime series surrounding a young child soldier overcoming her roller coaster of emotions after the war has ended and she has nowhere else to go. So after watching the show, how did it ultimately turn out? Well, I don't really want to say too much in fear of generating overhype, except for the fact that this is now my favorite animated show of all time. Better than The Owl House, better than Steven Universe, better than Dragon Maid, and even better than Gravity Falls, which is actually not that special, it's overrated, don't at me. The characters are lovely, the plot is intriguing, the setting is lifelike, the soundtrack is gorgeous, and the visuals are stunningly spectacular. But since I'm really late to the party, I've decided that I kind of want to delve deeper into the philosophy behind Violet Evergarden and the underlying themes it presents regarding post-war trauma and empathizing with others. So if you're a spoiler-sensitive person, you should probably click off this video immediately, go watch the show for yourself up to episode 13 and maybe the OVA, then come back for the review. With that out of the way, let's get right into it. The concept of Violet Evergarden is nothing special. I mean, it's certainly a good pitch for a novel or series, but not groundbreaking. It's another story about post-war trauma and the struggles of accommodating to peaceful life after going through such hard times on the battlefield. But unlike said PTSD war stories, Violet Evergarden is a 14-year-old child soldier, constantly said to be a tool, a weapon, and incapable of emotion. Almost like she was brainwashed. Now, we do get a lot of typical war veteran drama stories, but we don't get a lot of brainwashed child soldier stories, specifically stories about the child trying to process that they have free will, which is also another big theme in regards to war, or at least this show's take on war. In the first episode, you're expecting Violet to be this troubled and shaken up soldier who is afraid of literally everything, treading over familiar ground involving a typical PTSD war story. But instead, you're just suddenly taken aback by Violet's straightforward, expressionless attitude with the only intention of following Sir Gilbert's orders. Throughout the series, we're seeing Violet adjust to everyday life and perceiving it as some type of recruitment mission, which is perfectly understandable considering the fact that she's literally 14 years old and, repeating again, is constantly said to be a weapon of mass destruction. Speaking of which, the fight scenes are badass, but they are also appropriately yet uncomfortably gory. We certainly need more gore in war movies. But then there's this other underlying theme regarding the nature of war and just Mother Nature in general. The painfully relatable sentiment of losing someone you love or fearing that you'll lose someone you love. In comparison to other animated works, this is by far my favorite take on that theme, specifically because none of the episodes are riddled with overcoming grief and moving on messages, but instead riddled with moving through the loss and cherishing the memories he had with said person. And once we start factoring in the war aspect, Violet Evergarden goes into some incredibly dark places once it combines the two messages. Luculia expresses how thankful she is that her brother is at the very least living. Aiden's family is f***ing weeping after he dies a painful death. And after Violet realizes how much pain she's caused so many families just because she's killed so many people, she attempts to kill herself by way of self-strangulation with her metal hands. I mean, it happens, but it's near impossible to pull off. But then again, we don't have this kind of take on war and loss and self-loathing in the media. We don't have enough of this. You want to know what else we don't have enough of? Stuff like the best episode in this series. Violet Evergarden's 10th episode is probably the animated work I'm going to point to whenever I'm asked to give the single best example of how animation can communicate underlying themes of loss. This perfectly encapsulates the notion of moving through struggles and loss and living while the person you love so much is gone. Anne constantly worrying she'll lose her mother and wanting to spend as much time with her as possible is brilliant. Again, other works have constantly presented themes of dealing with grief and moving on, but why should we even move on from losing loved ones? Why should we just up and forget about them? Rather than moving on, this episode presents themes of moving through past struggles and living with the memories of said person. And what a brilliant decision it is to have Anne receive 50 years worth of letters from her late mother. I love this episode so much. Even if it didn't make me cry, it still is a very impactful animated work. Another important underlying theme in Violet Evergarden is empathy. Oddly enough, this idea of empathizing with others is shown both in presentation and practice. In other words, the idea is present as a theme of the show and a narrative tool in order for us to connect with the characters on screen. In short, for the narrative tool claim, Kyoani succeeds with creating characters we can empathize with specifically because we spend so much time with them and discover so many shades to their personalities, Violet Evergarden in particular. As an underlying message, the execution of the themes of empathy is perfection. I'm not one to say there is such thing as perfection, but there really is virtually zero amount of flaw in the compelling execution. I think the most prominent thing to say about the intricate delivery is that whoever decided to implement the auto memory doll concept is a genius. That alone brings to the table a unique exploration of empathy and emotion I've never seen before in animation. The simple concept of having our characters get to know each other and understand each other through writing is perfect. All throughout the series, we're seeing Violet herself grow in terms of understanding herself and understanding others. We know that because her letters are becoming more and more emotionally heartfelt. In episode 7, which is one of my personal favorite episodes, we explore the idea of how stories and fiction can touch others' lives and be a source of inspiration and life-changing experiences. You know, like animation is. Treading back to episode 10, which is by far the best episode, Anne receives an abundance of letters from her late mother, and the entire point of this episode is just the title of the episode, the notion that loved ones will always watch over you. In the OVA in episode 11, we cover letters to and from the battlefield, and how the soldiers and their families send those in fear of losing each other, something we don't get a lot in other works. And finally, in episode 5, where they address the sentiment that it's a lot better to write something yourself, rather than hire someone to write a sappy love letter poem. That is brilliant. And one thing I particularly like about this presentation of empathy is that each episode covers a different emotion and or concept that Violet needs to understand. Gratitude, frustration, romance, loneliness, grief, fear, acceptance. What's more, each of these emotions not only allow us to get to know said characters portraying those emotions, but they also allow us to discover more shades to Violet's character, and it allows her to understand those emotions, further understanding herself. She applies her knowledge of said feelings to better understand why she's feeling a certain way after everything she's been through. Speaking of Violet, Violet Evergarden, in my opinion, has one of the best character arcs in animation, and is probably one of the best protagonists of all time. She is honestly the perfect portrayal of a coming-of-age arc surrounding the message of empathy and self-understanding. At the beginning of the show, we see her being very stoic and neglectful to her own physical state, as well as her mental state, because all her life, she's been receiving nothing but orders from Gilbert. She's constantly being told she's a weapon of war. But as we find out later, she embraces that wholeheartedly and views herself as a tool. And over the course of her journey, she discovers not only more shades to other people around her, but also discovers more shades to her own character and attempts to evaluate those parts of herself. But what exactly is her journey? To find out what Gilbert meant when he told her, "I love you." This is, of course, silly, but it's a legitimate step forward for Violet to understand how people work and how relationships work, as she's never really been exposed to what we like to call everyday life. And as she continues her work as a doll, her goal begins to shift a little bit. Instead of trying to figure out what Gilbert meant, she then goes on to try to understand others around her. As she says it herself, that people often contradict themselves and have very complex and intricate emotions and demeanors that are difficult to understand. Then after a sudden realization of how much pain she's caused by killing soldiers that just wanted to go home, her goal then shifts from understanding others to understanding how she can help others. This is further reinforced in episode 10 and 11, when she is writing letters for future Anne and writing a letter back home for Aiden. Actually, the first instance of this goal is way back in episode 3, when she writes her first genuinely good letter to help Luculia express her feelings towards her brother. And then at the end of the season, when she fully understands human emotions and empathizing with others, she's just left with her own feelings to process. So she writes a letter to the seemingly late Major. At last, she can finally live how he wanted her to live, no longer viewing herself as a tool nor a burden to others, but viewing herself as an independent person. Seeing Violet going through all these phases in her character development, as she is exposed to the very intricate emotions of others and the harsh realities of war and loss, is astounding. Her arc surrounding empathy and trying to understand the world around her, as well as trying to understand herself, is one of the best character arcs I've seen, and it's also one of the most impactful and meaningful arcs I've seen. She really is one of my favorite characters in all of animation. It's kind of unnatural for me to talk so gleefully about Kyoani's works without mentioning the visuals. That said, Violet Evergarden might have the best visual aesthetic out of all their works. Aside from a silent voice and little tidbits of sound euphonium, this series has some of the most beautifully spectacular animation I've ever seen. Like, there's this one parasol scene in episode 7 that is a solid contender for one of Violet Evergarden's best moments, and may as well be one of the best moments in animation history, period. Aside from a silent voice and maybe Wall-E, Violet Evergarden has one of the best non-lyric soundtracks I've ever heard. And even the songs with lyrics are incredible. Each melody is so familiar, and you get used to it really quickly. The opening, the ending, and everything in between is just spectacular to listen to. I'll adore this soundtrack forever. I've already said my piece on Violet herself, aside from the fact that her design is just spectacular, so I may as well just talk about the other characters. Benedict and Catalia have incredible chemistry and play off each other very well. Major Gilbert is a sweet caretaker for Violet, though I have no opinions on his brother. Claudia is an excellent paternal figure. Erica and Iris are lovely best friend characters, though Iris is more interesting. Luculia and her brother are very solid characters. Charlotte is just a delightful princess, both literally and figuratively. Aiden, of course, serves his purpose in the story and is a character that makes you cry for weeks. Oscar, the screenwriter, is pretty good. Also, thank you for acknowledging how stories can change lives. Oh, and Anne Magnolia. Anne is the single best child character in existence. Curious, innocent, cares about her mother, is nonsensical with her reasoning and words, and fears for her life that she may be alone mentally without her mother. And her receiving those letters is honestly one of the sweetest moments in animation to me.
This is my winter song to you. The storm is coming soon. It rolls in from the sea.
I perfectly understand if Violet Evergarden isn't some people's cup of tea. Not everyone personally enjoys anime. Not everyone appreciates animation as much as I do. Not everyone is fond of drama. However, it is objective fact that there is an undeniable show of determination and ambition from Kyoani. They really went out of their way to make this one of their best works. And it is. It's tackling on the complex themes in regards to war and loss, as well as understanding the intricate emotions of others and trying to go closer to one another, is one of the most admirable and breathtaking things I've ever seen in animation history. The unique way it puts major emphasis on the harsh reality of war, the compelling execution in its message surrounding human emotions and self-understanding, and just Violet herself as a character and how she was constructed are vividly astounding feats that I've seen nowhere else in the animation medium with very few exceptions. Even aside from the underlying themes Violet Evergarden presents, the story is fantastic, the world they build is exceptionally great, the characters are just a delight, the music is painstakingly good, and the visuals are just so gorgeous and spectacular. I'm going to say things like that for the rest of my life praising Kyoani. I give this show a solid 10 out of 10. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. Violet Evergarden really is my favorite animated show of all time.